Nobody sent an alert. Nobody filed a report. The camera just sat there, bolted to a pine tree at 9,000 feet, blinking in the dark the way it always did, completely alone, completely automatic, completely indifferent to what it was about to record. And when the man who owned it drove 4 hours into the Colorado Rockies to pull the memory card that weekend, he wasn't expecting anything unusual. He was expecting elk. Maybe a black bear. Maybe nothing at all. What he found instead was something that stopped him cold in the middle of a dirt road, staring at a screen, unable to explain what he was looking at. And neither could anyone else. There is a particular kind of silence that exists above 8,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains that you cannot find anywhere else on Earth. It is not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street. It is older than that, heavier. It is the kind of silence that has existed for 10,000 years before humans ever thought to build roads into it, and it carries within it a subtle biological warning, the sensation deep in the back of the brain that something in that environment is watching, even when nothing visible is there. Most people who spend time in those mountains describe it eventually, not with alarm, but with certainty, the feeling that the wilderness is not passive, that it observes, that it remembers. Trail cameras were invented to cut through exactly that kind of mystery. A hunter or a wildlife researcher bolts one to a tree, sets the motion sensor, walks away, and lets the machine do what no human can watch continuously, without bias, without fatigue, without the tendency to rationalize what it sees. The camera does not feel uneasy. It does not talk itself out of what it records. It simply captures. And that is precisely why what one trail camera captured in the high country of the Colorado Rockies in the spring of 2025 became one of the most discussed and quietly unsettling pieces of footage to circulate among wildlife researchers, backcountry hunters, and wilderness investigators in recent memory. Because the camera saw something, and what it saw was not an animal. It was what an animal had left behind. But here's where it gets strange. The footage did not show a kill in progress. There was no predator on screen, no prey, no blood trail being followed, no chase, no moment of violence that conventional wildlife logic could slot neatly into a category and file away. What the camera showed was an aftermath, a scene that had already concluded before the lens ever triggered, and the nature of that aftermath broke every expectation that experienced outdoorsmen had built up over decades of reading wilderness sign. The ground had been disturbed in a radius that suggested enormous force or enormous weight. Trees at the edge of the frame showed bark stripped from their lower sections in patterns inconsistent with bear marking, consistent with nothing anyone present could immediately identify. And at the center of the frame, approximately 40 feet from the camera, there was a depression in the earth, large, deliberate-looking, cleared of pine needles and smaller debris that sat empty. Whatever had been there was gone. Think about what that means. A trail camera triggers on motion. Something moved through that zone and activated the sensor. But by the time the shutter opened, the motion had stopped. The scene that greeted the lens was not the act itself. It was the evidence of an act that had already ended. Which means whatever created that aftermath moved into the camera's range, made that scene, and cleared out before the sensor could document it in real time. In wildlife terms, that is almost unprecedented. Trail cameras have a trigger delay measured in fractions of a second. The window between motion detection and image capture is so small that researchers routinely catch animals mid-stride, ears still rotating, not yet aware the camera has fired. To clear a scene before triggering the shutter would require either a complete absence of movement after the act, or something moving with a speed and deliberateness that the camera simply could not track. What most people are not seeing in this story is that it does not exist in isolation. The Rockies have been producing anomalies that resist clean explanation for longer than most people realize, and the trail camera footage is the most recent and most visually documented entry in a pattern that researchers have been quietly cataloging for years. Former law enforcement detective David Paulides, who spent years cross-referencing missing persons cases in national parks across the United States, identified Rocky Mountain National Park specifically as one of the highest density zones for disappearances that carry what he describes as unusual characteristics. Cases where search dogs lose the scent abruptly at no logical boundary, where victims are found in locations that certified searchers had already swept and cleared, where experienced wilderness travelers simply stop existing in a landscape they knew well. Over 600,000 people are reported missing in the United States each year, and the national parks contribute a statistically disproportionate share of those cases. The Rockies, particularly the high elevation zones of Colorado, appear again and again in the data, and this is where everything changes. Because in the spring of 2025, the trail camera footage did not emerge from a remote location that had never seen human investigation. It came from an area that wildlife researchers had already been monitoring with cameras for an unrelated study. an effort to track wolf and cougar population dynamics in the post-reintroduction landscape of the Rocky Mountain corridor. According to informed sources within the wildlife research community, the camera network in that specific drainage had been active for over 14 months before the footage was captured. In 14 months of continuous operation, the cameras had recorded exactly the kind of wildlife activity researchers expected elk moving through on seasonal schedules: mule deer, occasional black bears, twice a mountain lion documented passing through at night. The ecosystem was behaving according to known parameters. And then, over the course of approximately 3 weeks in late spring, the animals stopped coming. Read that again. Not reduced, not rerouted, stopped. In 14 months, the camera at one monitoring station had triggered an average of 47 times per week across its detection zone: deer, elk, smaller mammals, birds large enough to trip the sensor. 47 events per week, consistent enough to serve as a reliable ecological baseline. Then, across a period the researchers can narrow down to about 18 days, that number dropped to less than 4. The elk stopped using the corridor entirely. The deer detours pushed west by nearly half a mile, crossing terrain they had not used in the previous year of documented observation. And during those same 18 days, the behavior of predators in the area shifted in a way that the researchers found distinctly unusual. Cougars that had been making kills in their established territory began staying within dense tree cover and elevation. Behavior consistent with avoidance rather than hunting. As one wildlife biologist who reviewed the data described it off the record, the prey animals were not simply avoiding a threat. The predators were too, but here's where it gets worse. On the 14th day of this behavioral anomaly, the camera captured its footage. Not the absence of animals, something else. The disturbed ground, the stripped bark, the clearing, and overlaying it all, in the corner of the frame where pine forest gave way to shadow, a shape that the researchers who reviewed the footage have declined to definitively characterize. Not because it was dramatic, because it was ambiguous in a way that felt deliberately so. It occupied the frame for 2 seconds, before the camera's motion trigger apparently reset 2 seconds, in which something was present at the edge of the image that was neither the size nor the shape profile of any animal native to that elevation corridor. And then it was gone. The real story is not what that shape was. The real story is what it wasn't. Wildlife researchers, who have spent careers reviewing trail camera footage from across the American West, describe the shape not as unknown in a frightening sense, but as inconsistent. Inconsistent with a bear, which produces a distinctive silhouette at any angle. Inconsistent with a mountain lion, which has a movement signature that cameras catch in recognizable ways even in low light conditions. Inconsistent with an elk, which produces a clearly identifiable body mass and limb profile even in shadow. What the camera captured in that corner of the frame was something that defied the checklist methodology researchers use to classify wildlife encounters on camera. And that is not a small thing. Trail cameras across the Rocky Mountain West collectively produce tens of millions of images per year, and trained researchers can identify a black bear in 4 pixels of blurred night vision footage. The fact that multiple qualified reviewers decline to make a firm identification from 2 full seconds of footage is not a detail to pass over. Now layer on top of that the geological reality of the environment these cameras were operating in. The high elevation zones of the Colorado Rockies, particularly in the zones between 11,000 and 13,000 feet, are among the least continuously observed wilderness areas remaining in the lower 48 states. It is a living record of biological continuity that stretches back further than most people can meaningfully conceptualize. But the animals inside are what make the scientific community truly pay attention. The Chinese giant salamander has been cited in the Shaozhou Tiankeng, a creature so ancient in its evolutionary lineage that it is sometimes called a living fossil. A species whose ancestors were swimming in the same rivers 65 million years ago that the dinosaurs were drinking from. The clouded leopard has been documented inside the pit as well, a rare feline with a global population estimated at fewer than 10,000 individuals. A cat so elusive and so poorly understood that scientists are still debating fundamental questions about its behavior and biology. Both of these animals have found refuge inside a sinkhole, cut off from the surface world, surviving in conditions that the outside world could not reliably provide them anymore. What most people are not seeing is what that fact implies about the surface world. A 2024 study published in the journal Forests used a technology called hypersec gene sequencing, one of the most advanced genetic analysis tools currently available to examine the DNA of Mangliotia aromatica, a rare tree species found inside the karst Tiankengs of Guangxi. What the researchers found was not what they expected. The genetic diversity of the Tiankeng populations of this tree was significantly higher than the genetic diversity of the same species growing on the surface. The diversity index for populations inside the sinkholes was 0, 2044. For populations outside, it was 0, 1671. This is not a small difference. This is a measurable, quantifiable gap that tells a precise story about what is happening to life outside these pits versus what is being preserved inside them. The surface world is losing genetic diversity. The sinkholes are keeping it. The Tianqings are functioning as genetic vaults, storing combinations of DNA that have already disappeared from the populations living in the open air above them. When scientists talk about biodiversity loss, they usually talk about species going extinct entirely. But what this research reveals is something subtler and potentially more dangerous: the gradual erosion of genetic variation within species that are still technically alive. When a species loses genetic diversity, it loses its ability to adapt. It loses its resilience against disease, against climate shifts, against the unpredictable pressures of a changing world. The trees at the bottom of the sinkholes are not just surviving. They are holding genetic information that the trees at the surface have already lost. According to informed sources within the research community studying these formations, scientists have begun to describe the Tianqing as potential refugees, not just from historical pressures, but from future ones. The logic is straightforward and chilling. Climate change is altering surface conditions at a speed that many species cannot adapt to. Habitats are fragmenting, temperatures are rising, precipitation patterns are shifting. But inside the Tianqing, conditions are stable. The thick rock walls insulate the interior from surface temperature fluctuations. The enclosed environment maintains consistent humidity. The isolation that makes these pits scientifically fascinating also makes them naturally climate resistant. Species inside the Tianqing are not experiencing the same environmental stress as their counterparts on the surface. And if surface conditions continue to deteriorate, the Tianqing may increasingly become the last places on Earth where certain species can survive at all. This is not a distant hypothetical. This is already happening. Researchers have confirmed that species found inside the Tianqing include animals and plants that have already gone locally extinct at the surface-level creatures that no longer exist in the wild outside the confines of the sinkhole ecosystem. The pit is not a curiosity. The pit is a sanctuary that formed before humans existed, and that is now, entirely by accident, doing the work of conservation that we have failed to do deliberately. And here is where the narrative takes a turn that nobody in the mainstream coverage is adequately addressing. The same Tianqing that are functioning as biodiversity libraries and genetic vaults and accidental conservation zones are now under threat from the very thing that usually follows discovery: tourism. When the 2022 Lehigh County sinkhole made international headlines, the immediate response from local authorities was predictably economic. The region around Lehigh County and the broader Guangxi karst formations has already been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of 30 such discoveries in the area, and the potential for ecotourism revenue is enormous. Several sinkholes in the region have already been converted into sightseeing destinations. Walking paths have been constructed. Viewing platforms have been installed. Ticket booths have been set up at the entrances to places that, until very recently, no human being had ever entered. What most people are not seeing is what that development means for the ecosystems inside. The closed, isolated environment that allowed these species to evolve and survive for hundreds of thousands of years is not compatible with human foot traffic. The microclimate that maintains constant humidity and temperature is sensitive to disruption. The underground water systems that sustain the forests at the bottom of the pits are vulnerable to diversion for irrigation and municipal use. The plants being discovered, some of them species that were presumed extinct for a century before being found alive in a sinkhole, are being harvested by local communities who regard them as resources rather than scientific miracles. Scientists working in the region have said this directly. The main threats to the karst Tianqing forests are ecotourism, groundwater diversion, and harvesting of plant resources. Every one of these threats is accelerating. Every one of them is a direct consequence of the discovery that made these places famous. There is a bitter irony in the realization that the act of finding these hidden worlds may itself be the thing that destroys them. We open the door, and now everything that the door had been protecting for thousands of years is exposed to exactly the pressures it had been sealed away from. In April of 2025, a new study published in the journal Phytokeys described yet another new species discovered in a Tianqing, this one in Guizhou province, a flowering plant called Impatiens maolinensis, found growing in a heavenly pit connected to a dried-up underground river, bearing orange-red flowers and displaying characteristics that distinguish it from every other known species in its genus. It had been sitting there, flowering and seeding and surviving, inside a closed ecological system, while the outside world went through 2 world wars, the invention of the internet, and the entire history of modern science without ever knowing it existed. There are approximately 300 known Tianqing in the world. The vast majority of them are in China, and the scientific community is only in the last decade beginning to systematically investigate what is inside them. What they have found so far, in the small fraction of these pits that have been studied, includes dozens of new species, genetically distinct populations of species that had been presumed extinct, Animals as dramatic as clouded leopards and as ancient as Chinese giant salamanders, forests of trees that are older than any human civilization, and a genetic diversity that the surface world has already lost and cannot recover. All of this has been found in a handful of these pits. There are hundreds more that no scientist has ever entered. Think about what that means. Think about what is sitting at the bottom of sinkholes that nobody has found yet. Think about the species that are evolving right now, this moment, at the bottom of karst pits in Guangxi and Guizhou and Yunnan that have not yet been spotted in satellite imagery by a man nicknamed Crow. Think about the genetic information being preserved in trees at the bottom of formations that are deeper than skyscrapers and older than recorded human history. Think about the species that have already gone locally extinct on the surface, but that are still surviving underground, unknown to science, waiting, not knowing they are waiting, but waiting nonetheless to be discovered. And then think about what we are doing to the ones we have already found. The trajectory here is not difficult to read. Discovery generates attention. Attention generates tourism. Tourism generates revenue. Revenue generates development. Development destroys the conditions that made the discovery significant in the first place. We have watched this cycle repeat itself in coral reefs, in rainforests, and ancient cave systems all over the world. The pattern is so consistent that calling it a pattern is almost too generous. It is a predictability. It is what happens every single time. And now it is happening to the Tiankeng, the biodiversity libraries, the accidental arcs, the places that have been quietly protecting species for hundreds of thousands of years without any human involvement, without any conservation policy, without any funding or management or planning, purely by virtue of being too deep and too inaccessible for us to ruin. What informed observers are watching closely is whether the Chinese scientific community and the relevant government authorities can implement protections that are strong enough and fast enough to get ahead of the development pressure. Some researchers have proposed designating the most significant Tiankeng as strict nature reserves, fully off limits to tourism, accessible only to credentialed scientists for limited periods of time. Others have advocated for a more graduated approach, permitting limited access under carefully controlled conditions while maintaining protected zones within each pit. Neither approach has been implemented comprehensively. And while the debate continues, the walking paths are being built, the viewing platforms are being installed, and the underground water that sustains those primordial forests is being diverted for human use. There is also a dimension to this story that the mainstream narrative almost entirely ignores the question of what we do not yet know about the microbial life inside the Tiankeng. Every survey of these pits has focused primarily on visible organisms, plants, insects, spiders, reptiles, mammals, but the karst Tiankeng also harbor microbial communities that have been evolving in isolation for periods of time that are, if anything, even longer than the isolation of the visible species. The high concentration of negative oxygen ions inside the pits, the constant humidity, the low temperatures, and the unique chemistry of the water flowing through the limestone all create conditions that may be supporting microbial ecosystems of extraordinary complexity and novelty. No comprehensive survey of Tiankeng microbiology has yet been conducted. What is alive at the microscopic level inside these formations remains essentially unknown. And this is where the story becomes something larger than a nature documentary. This is where the stakes move from biological curiosity to something with direct implications for medicine, for climate science, for our understanding of the fundamental mechanisms of life. Microbial species, discovered in isolated environments, have historically provided the raw material for some of the most important pharmaceutical breakthroughs in human history. Antibiotics, antivirals, anti-cancer compounds all have been derived from organisms found in caves, in deep sea environments, and geological formations that were only recently accessible to scientific investigation. The Tiankeng may be sitting on a microbial treasure chest that dwarfs anything we have found so far. We do not know, because we have not looked. And by the time we are organized enough to look properly, the conditions that generated that treasure chest may have already been compromised. What is living inside China's sinkholes is not just a collection of interesting species. It is evidence of a parallel biological history, a version of life on Earth that developed independently from the one we know, in isolation, in the dark, in conditions that the surface world abandoned millions of years ago. It is a record of what life looked like before we arrived and began rearranging it to suit our needs. It is a library that nobody built intentionally and that is now, despite being entirely accidental, more important to the future of biodiversity than almost any conservation project that human beings have deliberately designed and funded and implemented. The cameras went down. What came back was not just footage of strange creatures in a dark hole. What came back was a message about time, about isolation, about what happens to life when you leave it alone for long enough and what happens to it when you do not. The biologists who went quiet when they first saw the footage were not quiet because they were afraid. They were quiet because they understood in that immediate, gut-level way that genuine scientific discovery sometimes produces that they were looking at something that changed the context of everything they thought they knew. The question that nobody is adequately answering is this: how many more of these worlds exist? How many more heavenly pits are sitting undetected in the karst mountains of southwestern China, and in the karst landscapes of Southeast Asia, of Central America, of every region on Earth, where limestone bedrock has been dissolving and collapsing for millions of years? How many species are still down there, still unknown, still evolving in isolation, still preserving genetic lineages that the surface world has already surrendered? How much time do we have before the development pressure reaches every one of these places, and the doors that have been sealed for hundreds of thousands of years are finally opened for good? The Earth opened up in Lay County, and what was inside was something that had no awareness of us, no relationship to us, and no need for us. It had been doing fine without us for a very long time. The real question, the one that keeps the researchers who study these formations awake at night, is whether it will continue to do fine now that we have finally arrived. Something is still living at the bottom of China's Earth, thousands of feet below the surface, in formations that have been sealed for longer than our species has existed, in ecosystems that have no analog anywhere in the visible, cataloged, mapped world above them. And for every Tianqing that has been found and studied and documented, there are others that have not been, others that are still sealed, others that are still dark. And whatever is down there is not waiting for us to decide what to do about it. It has been there long before we had the language to ask the question. The real weight of that fact is something that science can measure, but cannot fully explain, and it is something that, once understood, cannot be unfelt.